Today I want to talk about gene drives, a really exciting but also controversial new technology. I present you first with this image of Jurassic Park because I think it can help us understand the implications of gene drives. It's a classic film where humans attempt to clone dinosaurs in controlled and confined environments, but in the end the dinosaurs escape and they wreak havoc. This analogy will make more sense as we move on in our discussion, but first, let's talk about what gene drives actually are. To understand gene drives, it's important to understand inheritance. Natural inheritance, or some of you may be familiar with the term Mendelian genetics, is where each successive offspring has an equal chance of inheriting a trait from their parent. Some of these traits are recessive, as shown by the red mosquitoes. Some of them are dominant and will be expressed more often, as shown by the yellow mosquitoes. Gene drives, on the other hand, ignore natural inheritance laws. Researchers essentially found a way to alter the DNA of organisms to ensure that a specific trait is always inherited. So with a gene drive, virtually all subsequent offspring will receive that trait. A gene drive, in other words, drives a gene through an entire species. It's important to note that this cannot be used on bacteria or viruses. It can only be used in species that replicate through sexual reproduction. So why are we talking about mosquitoes? Well, mosquitoes carry a lot of diseases that transmit to humans. Take malaria, for example. Malaria causes over 1 million deaths a year, mostly children, and half of the world's population is at risk. Most of these populations, however, are considered vulnerable and that they lack the resources to get drug therapy. This is a huge social equity issue. So with gene drives, we could actually take a mosquito and engineer it to have resistance to malaria. In theory, we could mitigate or completely eliminate malaria. This sounds great. There are other promising case studies. Ticks that carry Lyme disease could be altered. Mosquitoes that transmit malaria to humans also transmit malaria to birds. So we could use gene drives for conservation efforts. Take another example, invasive species. The common house mouse has been found to be the leading cause of extinction on islands. Now gene drives are being investigated as an alternative to traditional methods of eradication. Consider rodenticides, costly, poisonous, and not all that effective, with loads of adverse effects on the environment and other species inadvertently. There can also be applications of gene drives in agriculture. Take the plant amaranth, for example. Amaranth is considered invasive, and it has become very resistant to herbicides. So gene drives are a possible solution to control weeds such as amaranth. However, this example is a little bit more controversial than the rest, and we will come back to that. So, I told you about the good, but I would not be painting you a fair picture without telling you about the bad. Those mosquitoes we were talking about. Well, scientists are exploring 2 methods for eradicating malaria. The first one is creating a gene drive that creates a resistance in the mosquitoes so that they no longer carry it. The problem with this is that there are already some mosquitoes that have developed a resistance to that. Much like bacteria evolving a resistance to an antibiotic, making it less effective. Some scientists think resistance is inevitable. The second method is engineering a drive that passes on an infertility gene. So eventually the mosquito populations would dwindle. The problem with this is that it could eventually lead to the elimination of the species completely. eliminating mosquitoes is likely to alter ecosystems more drastically. In fact, the researcher at Harvard who even suggested fertility-reducing drives stated last week that he regrets this idea. His concern arises from a recent study he completed that confirms a long-suspected risk of gene drives. That altered genes very well might and could spread to places where species are not considered invasive, but rather they are a key part of the ecosystem. This can have cascading effects. Species don't follow our human-invented boundaries. The Harvard researcher labeled gene drives as remarkably aggressive, meaning a few altered organisms can alter an entire population or wipe out an entire population. Now I want to bring your attention back to the Jurassic Park analogy. Much like in the movie, where the dinosaurs escape, become aggressive, and wreak havoc, gene drives have the same potential if a proper protocol is not followed. The good news is that there are some researchers now investigating gene drives that eventually self-destruct after a couple generations. However, this research is so new that it's really unconfirmed at this point if it will even work. Now I want to do an overview of the good and the bad of gene drives. We can eliminate diseases. We can eliminate the need for pesticides and herbicides, things that have bad impacts on the environment. We can control invasive populations, but most importantly, we can contribute a lot to genetic research. On the other hand, though, species develop resistance over time, and species extinction is a grave concern. Also, there could be a lot of unintended consequences. More on that later. The reality is that we cannot know the effects of gene drives 100% with certainty until we release them into the wild. We need to accept that we are turning the Earth into a living laboratory, and we must acknowledge the possible consequences. For this reason, gene drives have a lot of ethical implications. For one, they're inherently anthropocentric. Anthropocentrism is the view that humans are more important than everything else on the planet. So this brings up a lot of questions, like, do we have the right to control other species simply for our own benefit? Or do we have the right to eradicate an entire species? Who gets to determine what is a pest? It turns out that amaranth I was talking about before has a lot of amazing nutritional properties. This plant has value, yet someone has labeled it as a pest, a weed. They want to destroy it. My assumption is that it is infringing upon agricultural profits. So where do we draw the line? Should anyone be able to release a gene drive that suits their needs? This also brings up an issue of informed consent. In research, informed consent is the idea that a participant is aware of the implications of a study and that they agree to participate in it. The problem with gene drives is that if one nation releases a gene drive, a neighboring country could quickly become part of the experiment, whether they liked it or not. So, along with some ethical conundrums, gene drives bring us unintended consequences. Or maybe more appropriately here, we should call them speculations. The domino effect is an example. In nature, everything is connected, so it would make sense that making changes in one place might affect another. Species don't follow our human-invented boundaries. There can be genetic crossover. Take a liger, for example, a cross between a lion and a tiger. Genes could interact between species in ways that we don't understand. Even more, there's concern about corruption. Take Monsanto, a company who has made its profits off patenting genetically modified organisms. So we already know that genetic modification has been exploited for profit. There's no guarantee that it will be used for a greater good for people. And also there are concerns about biological warfare. The lab setup needed for gene drives is low cost and easily accessible, and furthermore, the technology is actually not all that hard to master. This, coupled with the aggressive nature of gene drives, creates concern for exploitation in warfare. I think it's important to note at this point that current hopes and fears are based on speculation and not empirical research at this point. So gene drives may or may not be as promising or dangerous as we expect. So what do we do? I think it's important for us to slow down and proceed with caution. Personally, I want to note that I am against gene drives because I come from a perspective that's not so anthropocentric. I don't think that we have the right to alter other species for human benefit. But on that note, I am not against gene drive research. Research only helps us better understand the world around us, so gene drives can make invaluable contributions to our understanding of drug resistance and genetics. So this research has value. But before we open Pandora's box, I think we really need to take a step back and consider the ethics surrounding this issue. And also, we need to give special care to the laws that will control it. And in my opinion, nothing should be done until these things are addressed. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this presentation.